War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 45, the helicopter and its role in warfare. World War II was unique for several reasons. First, it was massive. The scale and scope unmatched before, or thankfully after. Usually, after such a conflict, peace and recovery is the first priority, yet the opposite happened, and everyone focused on the assumed next inevitable war, that between the Soviet Union and its various client states, and the United States and the West. The massive change in military technology that occurred during the war, culminating in the first primitive atomic weapons, did not stop, and advancing technology only recently introduced, such as jet aircraft, only continued at an even greater pace. The helicopter is one such technology that found its infant baptism in the closing days of World War II, but continued to be an essential component of future warfare, albeit one largely shunned by those who were most focused on the air. Like World War II, the Korean conflict saw the first helicopters used primarily for casualty evacuation and observation. The helicopter is inherently inefficient to a similarly priced and weighted fixed-wing aircraft. The early engines were incapable of providing enough lift to be of use beyond these early roles. In addition to its paltry payload, its range was limited, for the fuel required for any extended use only decreased its available carrying capacity. Within the context of the war that mattered, nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, they were utterly worthless. But it is exactly within that context that the helicopter's weaknesses were more than compensated by its amazing strength, the ability to take off and land nearly anywhere. As major conflict quickly became an unthinkably mad mess, the small wars that cropped up in the seam between peace and Armageddon became the area where the helicopter became the definitive technology. I am admittedly loath to call any technology a game changer. I hate the term due to its overuse, but the helicopter undoubtedly changed small wars right when they became the predominant form of armed conflict. Harkening back to last week's episode and several more discussing the nature of warfare, you have the combination of fires and maneuver. Each is necessary in its own way, but it is at the end fires that destroy the enemy. When a stronger power takes on a weaker power, the weaker quickly learn to flee when faced with that stronger enemy. Those that don't quickly die. In Afghanistan in 2009, we joked that the dumb ones were all dead after 8 years of fighting. In the American Revolutionary War, Washington and his army survived by moving faster than the British could and seeking refuge rather than direct conflict. In the American Indian Wars, both sides used horses, leaving neither with a mobility advantage. As such, the Americans resorted to reservations and attacking the refuge of the various tribes, where their relatively immobile families waited out the winters. The British in South Africa during the Boer War were likewise outmaneuvered by the horse-mounted Boer. They divided up the country with static outposts every mile, connected by barbed wire and telegraph. Again, unable to come to grips with the Boer commandos, they took the land-based families and concentrated them into camps, denuding the countryside, draining the swamp of the arid grasslands of homes and farms where the Boer men could flee to. Hence was born the concentration camp. Though itself little different than the reservations of the American Indians, except the British concentration camps were a temporary measure, though the intent was the same. The battle for mobility isn't necessarily the same as speed. Mountains, swamps, deserts, and jungles provide challenges for those not accustomed. The Arabs during the Turkish revolt in World War I were adept at desert movement, while the Turks highly depended upon rails and roads, both of which were almost entirely undefended in the expanse of Arabia. In Cuba, Castro's guerrillas were comfortable in the mountains in a way that Batista's poorly led, city-raised armies were not. And while the Viet Cong were not immune in the jungles and forests, they were certainly more comfortable there than the Americans. But the helicopter is capable of traversing all terrains, and far faster than any terrestrial-based form of transportation. The early helicopters were hampered, like all nascent aircraft, by their engines. The story of aircraft development is largely one of engine development. The argument over the P-47 or F-6F or F-4U as being better is largely mute, when understanding they were all powered by the same rotary engine. With the reciprocal engines powering the first helicopters, their roles were inherently limited. The breakthrough came with the development of the turboshaft-powered helicopter. It was the French who matched this in the early 50s, and the Alouettes aforementioned in the Fire Force were capable of hauling more than 2 passengers in a small and nimble airframe. So while in Korea, there were large rotary engine-powered helicopters that served as troop carriers, the size required to house the engines gave them very poor aerodynamics and limited capabilities. The famous UH-1 Huey was the first American helicopter to use the turboshaft, and it became synonymous with the war in Vietnam, as well as the song Fortunate Son. After a few iterations, the relatively small helicopter had a 1,500 horsepower engine, which not only gave it the power to carry a full infantry squad, but to maneuver in the hot environment of Vietnam. A few notes on the performance limitations of helicopters. The hotter the temperature and the higher the elevation, the worse the performance. Fixed-wing aircraft do not suffer nearly as much from atmospheric conditions as helicopters. So while in poor conditions a helicopter may be able to operate, it'll be severely hampered in combat conditions. Soon other helicopters joined the fight in Vietnam, the heavy-lift Chinooks and Sky Cranes, and the dedicated observation Loach or Little Bird. Hueys armed with rockets and miniguns were replaced by purpose-built Cobras, using the same engine, but narrowed for better aerodynamics and given dedicated guns in the chin of the aircraft that could be aimed by a dedicated gunner. This expansion into observation and attack aircraft were not driven by an operational imperative, but rather a bureaucratic one. Since the creation of the Air Force, the Army was explicitly allowed to procure aircraft for their own use. There was never a limitation in law that the Army could not procure fixed-wing aircraft. And as Vietnam ramped up, so too did the Army's procurement of simple fixed-wing, propeller-driven aircraft for observation. And quickly the Army realized that light armament on these aircraft was all that was required to fight the Viet Cong. The Air Force's expensive and fast-moving jets were becoming less and less requested. The Air Force rebelled against this judicious use of taxpayer money, and, in 1964, the Department of Defense ordered all fixed-wing aircraft to be transferred to the Air Force, who promised, and quickly reneged, to provide the same level of responsive support to the ground forces that Army aviators did. Almost immediately, the Army went on a crash program to find helicopters to replace these critical capabilities. At first, Hueys were used, but they lacked the maneuverability and speed to be survivable at the altitudes required for observation, and their poor aerodynamics and large frame, designed for troop carrying, limited their armed capability. So for 4 times the cost, the Army got a less capable airframe compared to the fixed-wing equivalents. The cost was not just monetary. Nearly 1,000 out of the 1,400 Loaches sent overseas were lost in Vietnam, and the majority to enemy fire. The Army configured its aviation assets in various ways. A good example was the red, white, and blue teams of the 1st Cavalry Division. The colors represented the missions each was expected to do. The red team were the Cobras, or armed Hueys, providing the firepower. The white team were the Loaches, providing the reconnaissance, and the blue team were infantry-carrying Hueys, or Slicks. The colors were well chosen. Red and white are the traditional colors of the cavalry guidons, while blue is the color of the infantry. When red and white worked together, they would sometimes be called, fittingly, pink teams. These units would be used for Quick Reaction Force, QRF missions, or working with blues to pick up downed aviators or isolated units. These highly mobile teams were often used to conduct damage assessment after airstrikes. Sometimes the pinks would launch and go on hunter-killer missions, the whites hunting for targets and the reds destroying what they found. The means were primitive. The unarmed Loaches would often drop smoke grenades on top of enemy they found, trusting to their speed and low altitude to protect them from enemy fire. These audacious tactics, with still relatively primitive aircraft, carried massive costs. Over 5,000 helicopters were lost in Vietnam, a little less than half of the 12,000 total helicopters deployed. This total aircraft loss was more than the Navy, Air Force, and Marine aircraft lost combined. And this was against the simplistic air defenses found in South Vietnam, small arms primarily. The fixed-wing jets were often dealing, and more successfully, with the far more capable integrated air defense networks in North Vietnam. Despite this, helicopters are the preeminent tool of modern small wars and counterinsurgency. They provide enough of a speed advantage to mass enough force in nearly any terrain to destroy any reasonable level of enemy capabilities. If the enemy is massed in unreasonable levels, then a small standby force of more traditional aircraft will quickly dissuade the enemy from presenting such targets. As with all warfare, there is always the balance of fire and maneuver. Maneuver being the more critical capability in any asymmetric warfare. And there is the further requirements to find, fix, and destroy. The fixed portion is found in the relative slowness of the ground-based enemy fighting an aerial-based force. The amount of fires required to destroy is likewise relative to the inherently small nature of the forces involved. This capability comes at costs. Primarily, the inherent vulnerability of helicopters to dedicated air defense networks and even simplistic small arms. In every conceivable way, the slow speed and low altitudes, compared to fixed-wing aviation, make rotary wing a more dangerous proposition. Additionally, the complexity of rotary wing means you pay a multi-fold premium to use a helicopter over a fixed wing. Any time a helicopter takes off and lands from a fixed wing capable airstrip, you have spent additional money and risked lives you didn't have to. Likewise, for as great as the helicopter is in small wars, it borders on criminally worthless in major conflicts with real air defense capabilities. And this is one of the catches. Until we are actually immersed in a small war, procurement of capabilities specifically for such conflicts, especially large-scale ones, are simply not allowed in today's Pentagon. No matter how anemic the capabilities, it must somehow fit into a fictional conflict against China or Russia. The Littoral combat ship, barely capable of sailing, much less fighting, had to create fictional scenarios of its usefulness against the Chinese Navy, affectionately and oxymoronically known as the People's Liberation Army Navy, or simply PLAN. The Army Stryker, an 8-wheeled armored personnel carrier, essentially unarmed and unarmored, that was designed to introduce troops into a permissive environment by C-130 due to experiences from Bosnia in 1996, had a fantasy scenario of, ironically, rushing to reinforce Central European nations against Russian aggression. The Osprey, combining the worst attributes of fixed-wing and rotary wing, was originally pushed in the 80s as a means to fly a platoon of Marines from Quantico to Germany to repel a surprise attack by the Soviet Union. That's not a joke. That was literally the talking point. Apaches had a suicide mission called Deep Strike, where they would maneuver behind 2 echelons of Warsaw Pact integrated and distributed air defense networks to destroy Soviet artillery capabilities. The main problem isn't the inherent lies built into the justification for both necessary and worthless procurement, though that dishonesty is admittedly problematic. The real problem is that as you shoehorn technologies incapable of surviving 5 minutes on a modern, peered battlefield, you cram in as much extraneous capability as possible to make the lie not so obvious, and this carries massive expense. So you double the cost or more with 0 additional real-world capabilities, which means in a zero-sum game environment, you have the amount of equipment available, and they quickly become so valuable and rare that you dare not risk them in any environment. So now you have combat equipment you dare not risk in combat, making them no longer combat equipment, but shiny wastes of money, saved for a fight they will never survive, and unused in a fight they would be useful in. So we were willing to sacrifice hundreds of Humvees, MRAPs, Strykers, Bradleys, and tanks, and the men in them, while sacrificing the one key attribute we needed for success in Iraq and Afghanistan, mobility, because our exquisite rotary wing capability was far too valuable to use. So we lost billions in vehicles, thousands of men, and, ultimately, both wars. The inherent disconnect between what is known as asymmetric warfare and peer warfare is so vast that Henry Kissinger opined in 1957, and correctly, in my viewpoint, that we needed 2 entirely different secretariats in the Department of Defense, not separated by branches of service, but by mission. One dedicated to all-out warfare against the Soviet Union, and one for the small wars, obvious by 1956 to everyone but the General Officer Corps. But for all of Kissinger's power and brilliance, he couldn't fight the very expensive demand that all equipment be all things to all people. Anything that is multi-role suffers twofold. 1, they will invariably not excel at any one mission, which in combat puts it at a deadly disadvantage to the specialist. And 2, it is inherently more expensive, which means there will be less of them. And no matter how capable, one ship, one aircraft, or one man, they can't be at 2 places at the same time. So you sacrifice mass, flexibility, and any sense of economy, of force or otherwise. Kissinger's view was more eloquently stated a few years later in the brilliant book The Centurions, a fictional account of the French War in Indochina and Algeria. Here the fictional colonel, pardon the pronunciations here, Raspagai, modeled after the very real and very gallant Marcel Bigot, wistfully requested, "I'd like to have 2 armies, one for display, with lovely guns, tanks, little soldiers, staffs, distinguished and doddering generals, and dear little regimental officers who would be deeply concerned over their general's bowel movements or their colonel's piles. An army that would be shown for a modest fee on every fairground in the country. The other would be the real one, composed entirely of young enthusiasts in camouflage uniforms, who would not be put on display, but from whom impossible efforts would be demanded, and to whom all sorts of tricks would be taught. That's the army in which I should like to fight. Usually neglected in the quote, but just as important, was the reply to his request. You are in for a lot of trouble. With this, my guarded enthusiasm for helicopters, despite their limitations, comes to a close and forces me to return to a subject promised from the beginning of the podcast, an overview of the writings of the king of operational theory, Antoine Jomini, for next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.